If an entire generation has done everything it was told to do, studied hard, went to college, worked the entry-level jobs, waited their turn, and still can't afford a home, can't clear their debt, and can't seem to get ahead no matter how hard they try, at some point the question has to stop being what's wrong with them and start being what's wrong with the system they inherited. Because here's what the data actually shows. Millennials and Gen Z are, by almost every measurable economic indicator, the most educated, most adaptable, and most financially aware generations in modern history. And yet they are also the ones most likely to be living with their parents into their 30s, most likely to be carrying student debt into middle age, and least likely to own property at the same stage of life their parents did. This is not a coincidence, and it is not a character flaw. This video is an honest look at why these two generations are dealing with something genuinely different. Not just harder in the way every generation faces hardship, but structurally, systemically different in ways that deserve to be examined clearly and without the noise. So stay with me, because one of the comparisons later in this video fundamentally reframes what financial success actually costs in 2026 versus what it cost 40 years ago. Now, like and subscribe and let's dive in. Number 1, they entered adulthood into economic disasters. Every generation faces difficulty, but not every generation faces difficulty at the exact moment they are supposed to be building the foundation of their financial lives. Millennials, broadly defined as those born between 1981 and 1996, entered the workforce at one of the worst possible moments in modern economic history. The oldest millennials graduated into the dot-com crash. The core of the generation hit the job market directly into the 2008 financial crisis, the worst economic collapse since the Great Depression. Entry-level jobs evaporated, salaries stagnated, the career ladder that previous generations had climbed rung by rung simply wasn't there in the same way. Gen Z, born between 1997 and 2012, fared no better at the starting line. The oldest members of that generation entered the workforce directly into a global pandemic that shut economies down overnight, eliminated entire industries, and reshaped the job market in ways that are still being understood. Compare this to the baby boomers. The generation born between 1946 and 1964 came of age during one of the longest periods of sustained economic expansion in American history. Jobs were plentiful, unions were strong, a single income could support a family. The economic wind was at their backs in a way that had less to do with their choices and more to do with the moment they were born into. You see, the starting line matters enormously, and you can argue that millennials and Gen Z did not get a fair one. Number 2, the cost of entry into a stable life has exploded. Here is where the numbers become impossible to ignore. In 1980, the average American home cost roughly 3 times the average annual salary. Today, that ratio sits closer to 8 times, and in major cities, it is significantly higher. A baby boomer who worked a modest job for a few years could realistically save a down payment and enter the property market. For a millennial or a Gen Z person doing the equivalent today, that same entry point requires either a significantly higher income, significant family wealth, or years longer of saving, in a rental market that has simultaneously become one of the most expensive in recorded history. And the education part compounds this further. Baby boomers who went to college paid a fraction of what millennials and Gen Z have paid for the same credential. Adjusted for inflation, the cost of a 4-year college degree has increased by over 180% since the 1980s. And crucially, that credential, which previous generations could obtain affordably and translate directly into stable employment, now frequently produces debt without the guaranteed return it once carried. So what this generation inherited was a world that told them the same rules applied. Study, work hard, buy a home, build a life, while quietly changing the cost of every single step without changing the roadmap. They followed instructions written for a different economic era and were then blamed for the gap between those instructions and the results. Number 3. They are the first generation to grow up under financial surveillance. This point gets far less attention than it deserves. Baby boomers and the generations before them built their financial lives in a relatively forgiving environment. Credit scores as a formalized system didn't exist in their current form until the late 1980s. The consequences of financial mistakes, a missed payment here, a period of unemployment there, a bad decision in your 20s, were real but not permanently encoded into a number that would follow you for decades and determine your access to housing, credit, and opportunity. Millennials and Gen Z have grown up under a system of comprehensive financial tracking from the moment they turned 18. Every late payment, every period of financial instability, every consequence of the economic disasters they inherited, recorded, scored, and used against them in applications for the very things that would help them grow. There is a particular cruelty in a system that scores people harshest during the years when they have the least resources and the most instability, and then uses those scores to restrict access to the resources that would create stability. It is a cycle that previous generations largely did not have to navigate in the same formalized, documented way. Number 4. The mental load is categorically different. Something changed between the baby boomer era, and now that doesn't show up in economic data, but shapes everything nonetheless. Baby boomers largely did not grow up with a real-time, always-on window into how everyone else was living. The comparison was local. Your neighborhood, your colleagues, your social circle. The gap between your life and the most aspirational version of a life was not served to you algorithmically every single day. Millennials and Gen Z have come of age under the weight of constant, curated comparison. Social media has created an environment where the highlight reels of the wealthiest, most successful, and most fortunate are permanently visible, and the psychological tax of that visibility is significant. Studies consistently show higher rates of anxiety, depression, and financial shame in these generations than in their predecessors at the same age. And financial shame has a direct economic cost. It delays conversations that need to happen. It prevents people from seeking help. It drives spending decisions rooted in appearance rather than reality. The mental load that this generation carries, the comparison, the shame, the anxiety, is not weakness. It is the predictable output of an environment that previous generations simply did not live inside. Number 5. The retirement safety net was quietly removed. Here is perhaps the most significant structural difference between what baby boomers inherited and what millennials and Gen Z are facing, and it is the one most rarely discussed in generational conversations. Baby boomers largely entered a workforce that offered defined benefit pension plans. You worked for a company, you stayed loyal, and at the end of your career, the company provided a predictable, guaranteed income for the rest of your life. The retirement risk sat with the employer. Somewhere in the 1980s and 1990s, that model was dismantled and replaced with defined contribution plans, 401s, IRAs, individual investment accounts. The retirement risk was quietly transferred from institutions to individuals, and the generations who bore the full weight of that transfer were millennials and Gen Z, who entered a workforce where retirement was now entirely their personal responsibility, requiring financial literacy, consistent contributions, and market stability that none of them could guarantee. They were handed individual responsibility for a system that previous generations had institutional support navigating, and then when the outcomes differed, the difference was attributed to personal failure rather than structural change. You see, none of this is an argument for their helplessness, and it is not an attempt to flatten an entire generation into victimhood. There are millennials and Gen Z individuals building remarkable financial lives. There are people in these generations who have adapted, innovated, and found paths that didn't exist before. The entrepreneurship rates, the creative economies, the entirely new industries that these generations have built from scratch are real and significant. But adaptation under pressure is not the same as a level playing field. And the honest conversation, the one that tends to get drowned out by older voices telling younger generations to simply work harder, is that the field has changed. The rules have changed. And acknowledging that is not an excuse. It is the beginning of an accurate diagnosis. The unluckiest generation is not unlucky because of who they are. They are unlucky because of when they arrived. Well, I hope this was eye-opening and helpful, and if you have something to say or share, do drop it in the comments below. With that being said, have a great day, and see you tomorrow in the next video.